Good day to everyone joining us from United States, India, and all around the world. I'm Aparna Pande, Director of Hudson Institute's Initiative on India and the Future of South Asia. The first 2 decades of the 21st century have witnessed a deepening of the India-US partnership, especially in the defense arena. From almost no defense trade in 2000 to around 20 billion in 2020, from little cooperation in the military arena to India becoming a major defense partner in 2016. And from almost no synchronization in the defense arena to strong cooperation in Indo-Pacific and beyond. However, will the India-US relationship finally become the key American partnership of the next century? Something President-elect Biden, then Senator Biden, spoke of as early as 2006. To discuss this, we have with us today two excellent speakers who are also very good friends of mine. We have Admiral Shekhar Sinha. He's a former Chief of Integrated Defense Staff and former C-in-C Western Naval Command of the Indian Navy. And Abhijnan Rej. He is Security and Defense Editor at the Diplomat and Director of Research at Diplomat Risk Intelligence. Thank you, Admiral Sinha. Thank you, Abhijnan. I welcome both of you. There's a lot about India-US defense relations that is discussed in the media, but there's a lot more that is rarely mentioned. And so what I hope is that our panel today will go into that. Before we go into a detailed discussion, I would request each of you to offer some opening remarks broadly on the evolution of India-US relations. Admiral Shekhar Sinha, if you could go first.
Well, thank you, Dr. Aparna Pande, for this participation opportunity with Hudson on the US-India defense ties. Now, let me straightway begin by saying that US-India defense cooperation has been the most or the single strongest strategic shift in the bilateral relations between the two countries in the last 2 decades, as you mentioned, of this century. As you said, it began from nowhere, and now we have come to very comprehensive strategic defense ties. I recall when we started the first Malabar exercise in 1993, I got a sense that the US Navy is primarily wanting to see as to how much of Soviet influence had, penetrated into the Indian naval systems by looking at their, the tactics of how to do the operational maneuvers. Why I say this is because of our conversation, very casual conversation that we had. But what happened was that when we started this, and I was participating in that as a young commander, when they saw us that tactical maneuvers are being carried out just as per the NATO standards from the NATO books of reference. And that surprised them no end. The signal that we used to pass was completely the codes being used were all used by the NATO and allied countries. I'm talking about 93 when even the Americans were using the same thing. So that was the beginning where the US Navy and ultimately the US began to realize that, there is a, shall I say, interoperability of the system of the communication, not the communication system, but the communication itself. And we are all their reservations were, moved away. The semblance of these operating procedures, the basis of interoperability, which we have so often today by virtue of having the same equipment, similar platforms, and signing of those 3 fundamental agreements. I'll come to that further. What actually prevented India from going further after 1993 when we started Malabar? Well, you give or take 4 or 5 years when the Malabar still began to settling down. India was quite concerned at the political level and bureaucratic level and also the military level. I may add that. The close relation that Pakistan enjoyed with US, it gave us a little bit of, sense that, it is not the right time to go any further. And it got further intensified that in one of the Malabar exercise, again, I was sort of participating as a captain of a ship this time in the rank of captain. We were all using the Centrix equipment for, making sure that the confidentiality and the codes that we used was, similar, interoperability was more. And we were quite shocked that, the Centrix was all linked to the CENTCOM operations room in Bahrain. And we have had two Pakistani naval officers who were part of the CTF 50 and 51, 150, 151. They were actually monitoring this entire thing. And the entire picture was actually landing up in Karachi MOC, Maritime Operations Center. Don't ask me how do we know, but just we leave it at that. So that actually gave us even more further sort of goose pimple. And Malabar actually became a very drag subsequently. We're not very keen to do it, and it became slowed down. I'm saying all this because Dr. Aparna has said that if you can give a background how we have developed to come to this place. Otherwise, this is all history, it's all recorded history. But subsequently, when the US began to fight the global war on terror, and they had Pakistan as a partner because it couldn't be helped. All the logistics support, etc., were being done from Pasni. And we came to know much later. We were exercising. I was off Pasni at that night, and I saw this aircraft taking off from aircraft carriers from some distance. I only saw aircraft landing in Pasni airfield. So I was a bit surprised, and we did little bit of searching on the in the communication channels, and we heard the US Navy aircraft actually landing. So we were wondering what is happening. So that was the troops being landed, and so much so that the load of the aircraft was so much that this Pasni airfield actually started sinking, and they had to stop the work at stop flying from Pasni. And thereafter, they actually did some repair work. So having done that, we realized that the Pakistanis are important, and it will take some time for the US, and rightly so, because they have their own global sort of reach. We don't have global reach, but for us, Pakistan is what it is. Uh, and therefore I was in fact I made a report that I don't think it's time to, though I was very young officer, junior officer, but I did say in my report that it is quite possible that it is their compulsion, strategic compulsion of US, but at this point in time we should not be moving ahead in any Comcasa, etc., etc. So well, I guess it was taken quite seriously. But then when global war on terror, uh, the Americans realized that though Pakistan was a partner in global war on terror, it was not. It was actually helping the Al Qaeda to sort of prevent that from happening and killing large number of NATO forces and large number of Americans. And that actually changed President Obama's whole view about Pakistan. And then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was a very, very supportive to Pakistan, and she mentioned openly that if you keep snakes in your backyard, they will come back to bite you. The very famous statement she made, and she made it on a sort of TV channel, and everybody quoted this. And then there was a pivot to Asia. That is when the 60% of particularly the naval forces were committed. They were shifted from the West Asia, as we call it, or Middle East, as the rest of the world calls it. We call it West Asia only because it is to west of India. That's what it. And it shifted. And then we had some Marines being positioned in Australia and activity in this part of the world. Well, then Asia Pacific and Indo Pacific was being used sort of simultaneously for some time till President Trump and the Trump administration came, and they really lifted this to some very dizzy heights. And I must say that though Mr. Trump is going off, the military sort of partnership of US and India hasn't seen this kind of accelerated rise in a period of 4 years. I wouldn't have believed, but it happened. And let me just give you one more sort of background to this. that in 2009, 10, 11, I was heading the Integrated Defense Headquarters, and we had been given the copies of a draft copy of Limoa and Comcasa and Baker. And the first one, the Limoa, we had done a lot of study, and with those apprehensions in mind, what I mentioned a little while ago, we had done a lot of corrections to that, and we had put down the paragraph which we wanted to be put just below the paragraph which was mentioned in the original document. And we had to work very hard. We had the combined team of IDS headquarters and in the Ministry of External Affairs. I remember Javed was JS America at that time. So we did that and we gave it back. And Secretary Leon Panetta had just taken over as Secretary of Defense. And in the discussion, I also happened to be there along with the Defense Secretary. And I raised this question. And my question was, it wasn't taken very well, but I had said that Secretary Panetta, may I tell you that, the Limoa, what I read and other agreements, they appear to be US actually dealing with a country which has a very weak armed forces, which doesn't have, much of intellectual capacity to absorb all those. But let me tell you, you're not dealing with those countries, you're dealing with India. And India has its own, fairly strong armed forces, very intelligent people. They can read between the lines. So you will have to do some amendments to this, or you can have an India-specific Limoa.
Admiral Sinha, if you don't mind, I actually wanted to do this, sort of talk about this subsequently.
Okay.
The military. I want to do military exercises, then agreements, but one by one.
Okay.
I want to do a history first and then go into each of them one by one. So if you don't mind.
Okay. I will just cut it short. Yeah. And what happened was that finally it took 10 years to sign all this. And this is where we are. These three agreements have helped us. We have already seen the advantages in the field. And I'm sure that it will go. And as Dr. Aparna rightly pointed out, the challenge is that how is Joe Biden, President-elect's administration, going to look at this entire thing, and at what rate does it accelerate? We have come to a very level of complex exercises that we can do, and what will be the sort of charter of these, Malabar in future? Can it be linked to Quad or not linked to Quad? That is another question. So I'll stop here because we have much more to go.
Yeah, because I will go into each of these. I want to do exercises, agreements, and the future as separate segments.
Sure. No
Abhijnan, if you could offer your opening remarks.
Yeah, so thank you, Aparna, for inviting me to speak at this webinar. As Admiral Sinha very rightly pointed out, and we also mentioned, in many ways, the India-US defense relationship would be, I hope, one of the defining linchpins of the future of the Indo-Pacific. Admiral Sinha has very nicely recounted some of the history. What I'll do in my hat as an analyst is try and look at the India-US defense relationship from a conceptual standpoint, in many ways, because that disentangles some of the threads that are important. So, to begin with, how does two countries come about to cooperate militarily? You have to ask yourself that, and that's a fundamental question. So, at the top, if you imagine a schema, at the top you have the issue of political congruence. So, congruence around whether both countries see similar threats, their view of the international system, what they expect out of the international system over a fixed time horizon. And that political congruence then leads to common political military objectives, right? Which then, if there's convergence even at that second tier, then that leads to interoperability, which is that then sustained through legal agreements, common weapon systems and platforms, military exercises, doctrinal convergence. What is interesting is that each level of this three-step process, you have domestic factors, unit level factors kind of stepping in, either accelerating the process or inhibiting it. And I would argue that in many cases, when it comes to India-US relationship, there have been significant domestic factors that have come into play and that have inhibited this process. So with that in mind, Let me just kind of run through very quickly the issue of political congruence, because I think that is very important. The other two kind of follows from that. And I would say that despite a lot of warmth, a manifest improvement in the defense relationship between the two countries, you have problems with how both countries see the world, right? Mm-hmm. You just have to go to the 2017 national security strategy of the Trump administration, or the whatever excerpt of the classified NDS, the Indo-Pacific, the next year, the Indo-Pacific strategy report of 2019, to realize that, there is a problem there. So think about great power competition, which is what the Trump administration had kind of highlighted in all three documents. Well, China is a problem. I think India wouldn't mind the idea of China being a problem. But what struck me when I very closely read whatever I could get my hands on about this coming out from the US, was this emphasis on Russia, right? And Russia is a threat. Russia is a threat in the Indo-Pacific. Now, I would submit that is not something that India would ascribe to. I mean, if you think about India's Indo-Pacific vision, for example, India has welcomed Russia into the Indo-Pacific as an inclusive actor. So that's one part. Preference for multipolarity, again, when it comes to political congruence, right? India prefers a multipolar world. I would suspect the Trump administration just wants to perpetuate American hegemony. So, like all great powers should. So you have these things. You have domestic factors coming in especially from the Indian side. So even if you look at the right wing in India and forget the left, even the right wing, there is a latent degree of suspicion about the West, about Western intentions, and it kind of sometimes shows very overtly, sometimes it doesn't show that overtly. And there's this instrumental view of the United States, there, for example, Rahul Sagar has written about it. I've written something on with Rahul on this. So that's the problems with the stickinesses with political congruence. Common political military objectives. I would say India's military view, is still predominantly continental. And that became very clear to some of us when we looked at the 2017 joint doctrine of the Indian Armed Forces, first ever public joint doctrine. And it was overwhelmingly continental. The thrust was continental, focus in Pakistan, some focus on China. Maritime power projection, for example, was near absent from the 30-odd pages document, right? That's not the case with the United States. Domestic factors come in, right? They kind of inhibit some of this defense spending. Maintaining large navies are very expensive. And what you see in India is a lot of defense spending, but I would submit a lot of defense misspending, also in terms of a skew towards revenue as opposed to capital expenditure and military mobilization. I would say in all of this, the interoperability, the bottom part of it is where things are very good, fairly solid. Legal agreements, I'm not going to get into the 4 legal agreements, the 4.5, because we also have the Industry and Security Annex to the 2002 one. Legal agreements are there. Military exercises, yes, very good. 14 times over the past 5 years was my last count of the number of times the two countries have exercised together. But again, you see, I just conclude with 2 things. Interoperability is more than agreements and military exercises. You have to also talk about common platforms. Yes, there is a lot of American platforms now being operated by the Indian military, but there's a lot of Russian platforms that are also being operated. So that presents a problem. Doctrines, I think there is still some degree of work that needs to be done because, for example, US naval doctrines and India's naval doctrine, insofar as one can make it out from public documents, there is a degree of dissonance. So I would say things are great, but some work needs to be done.
Thank you, both of you. Now you've sort of given me some food for thought. And so my first set of questions actually is going to pull on something both of you said. Admiral Sinha, you started your talk by referring to 1993 and the Soviet Union and the fact that, India had a lot of equipment which was Soviet and the Americans weren't sure how much of an influence that had. And Abhijnan mentioned the fact that, Russia does play a role. For the US military establishment views it as a threat. India would prefer if Russia was involved in the Indo-Pacific or Russia was weaned away from China. We would ideally prefer that. So my question to both of you is this. Considering that India, US have, have the largest number of bilateral military exercises, considering that India and US do have some basic, convergence, even though there are a number of differences on the geographical, arena of the Indo-Pacific. India would prefer a little more of the Gulf coming in. The Americans are a little more on the Pacific side and not the Indo as we would like it. One, what role does Russia still play in India's concept of, the Indo-Pacific, as well as how does the Indian military still view the role of Russia, not just the equipment, but do we have sort of, what are our relations with Russia? And the reason I'm asking is, will this have an impact on how far we can go with the Americans in the defense arena?
Sorry, can I?
Yeah, sure.
That's really a tough question, really. But thank you for asking this question. My own sense is that as far as the Russians are concerned, their influence on operations or their influence in maritime field in the Indo-Pacific, I would say that it is almost nil. It is very marginal. And it's only occasionally that they come here, and they come mainly because the Chinese have to be exercising with them. But if you see the force levels and the times that they actually take to sea, and the operating procedures are fairly archaic. Not that we have used it, but we have seen them operating at sea. That's number one. The second thing is that by now, I would think that Russia-India relationship is more of a buyer and seller. It's nothing beyond that. And we are not buying ships. All ships are built in India. The last one you would have seen that the 2 frigates which are supposed to come, which was leftover of the previous regime, as far as ships are concerned. It's only the older contracts which are being sort of put into practice. Otherwise, they're put into use. Otherwise, you will end up paying fair amount of the damages, liquidity damages. So I would think that of course, Abhijnan mentioned about continental, but I also mentioned about there has been a strategic shift in India's thinking, and from this see blindness to now they have actually come to see brightness, and that is the reason that Prime Minister made a mention of Sagar, search and the security and growth of oil in the region. And he mentioned this in Mauritius, which is a completely a maritime nation. So I think there is this is the biggest shift that I have seen in my 42, 43 years in the Navy. This has been a very significant shift in India's thinking, both in the polity and the military. Yes, you saw that our Defense Minister, Honorable Rajnath Singh, rushed to Russia to get some more additional MiG-29s, and but the fact remains that it's about that time when the Rafale came to India. So I think that it is a transition now, and you will find that slowly the presence of Russian platforms is going to become less. I'll just close it here, but before I close, I must tell you one thing, that when we used to buy the Soviet equipment, they were already tried out in the Soviet armed forces. And we also had a backup that in case the original equipment manufacturer cannot give us the logistic support, we could always fall back on the Soviet armed forces. Unfortunately, the Russia per se, this has declined completely, because some of the components were built in Kazakhstan, some were built in Uzbekistan and things like that. So it is getting them together is a big problem, because they're having problem amongst themselves. So I would think that it was a correct time for India to actually say that we cannot put all the eggs in the same basket. I went for 2-3 logistic, delegations, and it was such a tough time, Dr. Aparna, that anybody's guess. So wow. I would think that slowly we'll find that even the platforms, there will be more platforms of the American, French, and maybe British origin than of Russian origin. But you can't help the ones which have come. They have a life. They have to be run. But I foresee that this changing, particularly when the Make in India and US transfer of technology, etc., that rectified, they will find more and more confidence in the Indian polity to sustain the new weapon systems which are coming from the West.
Thank you. Abhijnan?
I think I'd largely agree with what Admiral Sinha said, but I'd also point out that despite the fact that the India-Russia relation is largely transactional, I think there's a geopolitical dimension to this transactionalism. So imagine a world, it's a thought experiment where India tomorrow says to Putin that we're not going to buy anything from you and we'll go our own ways. There's this lingering fear, which he also expressed, that this would just make Moscow come closer to Beijing. So as long as there is this degree of transactional leverage or buyer's leverage, if you wish, on Moscow, you can hold them together. You can just kind of hope that Russia doesn't come very closer to China. To the extent to which it has worked in this direction remains, one can debate this for a while. So that's one remark. The second part is, the notion of strategic autonomy, which is so ingrained in Indian thinking, whether you call it non-alignment, multi-alignment, you could call it whatever, it's strategic autonomy, so ingrained, that I think even if the Indian government today wants to jettison Russia, say, or other countries and say, well, let's make the Quad the backbone of the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific, it's going to be a politically extremely difficult sell, domestic, right? So therefore, you see this emphasis on inclusive Indo-Pacific. This is not a club. It's not against anybody. It's for everybody. You hear things like Vladivostok-Chennai corridor. You hear about a Lemoa-like agreement being in its final stages with Russia. So I think again that's what I meant when I said in my introductory remarks, that there are all these domestic factors, unit-level factors, that play a very important role in India's defense relationships with either the US or Russia or any other country.
Thank you. So my next question is targeted at both of you mentioned, and most of the Indian media talks about two things when it comes to India-US defense relations. The 4.5, I'll use Abhijnan's word, for the 4.5 agreements or enabling foundational agreements we've signed, and the large number of military exercises that the two countries conduct. What I am interested in is sort of, what has these agreements really changed between the India-US defense relationship? Is it simply a question that India is like the other American military allies? Is it that India has provided, some technical assistance? Is it that India has provided equipment? For example, I remember reading somewhere that through Lemoa, India managed to purchase some equipment for its troops on the border. So what is it that these agreements actually do give India? And if they are so important, why did we take 18 years to sign the 4.5 agreements? So I'll address to both of you. Admiral Sinha, I prefer if you would sort of look at it with your older hat of the former Navy person, that, what was some of the, as I say, hesitance that the military had against signing these agreements? Was it more the reluctance of the military, or was it more to do with political issues? And Abhijnan, I'd like your expert hat. Admiral Sinha.
Thank you, Dr. Aparna. You've been hitting on the absolutely right nerve and right chords to a former Navy man. I'll take the last point first that you made as to, was it the armed forces or was it well, I would say that it was more of a political and bureaucratic hurdle than the hurdle from at least for the Navy part. Why I say this, that some of the responses that we gave, even for the Quad and Malabar, I know for sure that Navy had accepted it long back. But the polity, found it right for whatever reason, and those reasons I'm sure Abhijnan will probably put it across. But having said that, I also mentioned in my previous opening remarks that it took such a long time for us to sign is mainly because the initial hesitation of the armed forces, of the information through these Lemoa and Beka and Komkasa going across to Pakistan, because the relationship of Pakistan actually has been driving the Indo-US relation. As, this has always been the case. And now, at the moment when we are, getting the Biden administration here, everybody is watching, as to what is going to be equation with, not so much with China. Why? Because I know, or we know, that by and large, you cannot undo what Trump administration has done as far as China is concerned. It can slow down, but you cannot stop it. So that's the point I'll make. Whereas Pakistan is shall I say that it's an irritant on day-to-day basis. And whatever China is giving to Pakistan, it's all pointing to east of Pakistan, meaning towards India, southeast. There's no rocket science in this. So that equation of the US with Pakistan is a very important factor in intensifying or divergence between the two countries. And this is why when the Prime Minister Modi saw that Mr. Trump has gone that far, you see the expeditiousness of signing of these agreements and formation of the Quad sort of all minister level, and with signing with Australia and Japan. It is not just by the way. It's a very big strategic shift of India from looking continental to the oceans. Now, why I say continental? What has continental strategy given to India? Nothing. You don't have a business on land. You don't have neighbors who can take your item. You never have any good relation. So I would say that the shift in thinking is a big thing. Today, what has happened to land border? We are protecting so that somebody else doesn't come inside. So that much for your continental strategy. As a naval man, I would say this.
I was hoping for something. I was hoping my naval man would. Abhijnan.
I think, Pranav, when you look at the four agreements, beginning with the 2002 agreement to protect military information, all the way to BECA, which was signed last year, I think what has happened is the secrecy surrounding these agreements have led to a lot of myths, right? And often that has hindered the case of India-US military cooperation. I'll start with LEMOA. Now, what is LEMOA? LEMOA is a simple logistics agreement, which is essentially tells you, if I use your port for a military exercise, I'll take some oil or some supplies from you. And if you use mine, you do that, and we'll all keep a tally of who's doing what. Essentially, logistics support for each other. How do I know what LEMOA contains? Well, you see, India recently signed something very similar, like India-US LEMOA, which remains classified, with Japan. Now, Japan being Japan, they put out the text of the whole thing on their foreign ministry website, which was very useful because you kind of go through it and you're like, there's nothing in it. But why I say this with LEMOA is because if you look at the commentary in the run-up to LEMOA being signed in 2016, there were people saying, well, American soldiers are going to run away with our women. No, I'm not kidding. I'm not going to name who said it. I think probably said it. But no, so because there was a degree, and yes, and there would be bars in no, a part of it is this mistake of what LEMOA actually does. Because I think some people were conflating LEMOA with the status of forces agreement.
Yes. And
these two are analytically quite distinct. So that's LEMOA. I think Admiral Sinha has talked quite a bit about Komkasa and the fear and the Centrix interoperability with CENTCOM in Pakistan that is known. But I'll also say where there's a sense that the relationship often is the victim of hype. And that became very clear with BECA. Now, what is BECA? It just tells you that the US will share certain geospatial intelligence it possesses with India, which would improve Indian targeting against certain targets, whatever the targets are. And once you sign BECA, some of the things that the platforms you have already obtained from the US or are in the process of obtaining from the US, like, for example, Predator, if we were to go for Predator drones or other drones, then the accuracy of these drones, if they're armed drones, improves because you have all this geospatial intelligence, right? This is what it is as far as I can tell. Now, when you look at some of the Indian media reporting that happened, there were like, well, it will improve the targeting capabilities of Indian ballistic missiles. I'm like, there is no way US Congress will allow that to go through. Partly because in India, there is this thing that either the relationship, India-US defense relationship is the greatest thing in the world, or it's just a Western conspiracy and the Americans are going to come and take over your armed forces. And it never quite settles in the middle. And I think that's my sense with the foundational agreements.
No, thank you. Thank you. Both of you have talked about the Quad and talked about Malabar right from the beginning. And I agree. What I would like to ask each of you is, the Quad took a long time, right? I mean, it's like Malabar of the 1993s, but let's say the sort of, Japan went in and out, and Australia sort of, the first time was only last November. The Quad has also been spoken about for about a decade or more. And it finally it took it almost 10 years to come about. So analytically speaking, Admiral Sinha, as a Navy guy, your naval hat, what is what is the Quad's use to India? Is it simply a platform where people sit and talk? And it it's a good talk shop, as some people call it? Or does the Quad actually give any defense or military, benefits to India? And Abhijnan, as the analyst, has Quad really progressed from being a talk shop to being something more today? Admiral Sinha?
Well, the short answer is no. It hasn't progressed the way I am personally very disappointed that, the manner in which it has not progressed. So it's a disappointment. And since you've told me naval man, then, I have to be very brutally frank. So, because navies don't have boundaries, they operate in open oceans. As far as India's sort of establishments are concerned, the bureaucracy or the polity, it is still seen as a non-military organization, where we are looking at economy, compatibility, supply chain, COVID vaccine, the HADR issues, those kind of issues, because the military is not a part of Quad at the moment. That is one. Why I'm disappointed is, there is no institutionalization right now. I would have been very happy and I would have said something else if the foreign ministers meeting, if they had come out with some, a combined, if nothing else, a combined sort of statement, which didn't come out. Every country gave its own statement. It would have said, okay, we will have a secretariat, we will have this, we will have this, we will have this, and this is how it will progress. So it is still work in progress. I don't think that Quad, but yes, it gives you a little bit of consolation in your own mind that at least for the supply chain, and I believe that some work is already done in this, Australia, Japan, and India. US is not there right now, but ultimately they will be making it for something which is finally assembled in the US. So that way US is very much there. So that talk has already happened, and I think there is some progress. So that is part of the Quad. But if you ask me very frankly, well, it hasn't reached where it should have reached. And I would still put it as work in progress. It doesn't have a military dimension at all. But I have been canvassing on most of my writings and programs on the TV that, the Malabar actually provides a good platform that at a short notice, the Quad could task the Malabar countries, participants, if I may say so, diplomatically correct, may task them with a particular mission in which the 4 countries will go. Or depending upon which part of the Indo-Pacific, the requirement is, the country of that particular part will lead that charge and the rest will be in supporting role. It's quite possible, and it is done. We have the task forces. We call it commander task force. Even within the Navy, make a small task force, send him for a mission. So it will probably be mission-based deployment. So I think I would say that that's my own sense.
Abhijnan? Thank you.
Oh, I completely agree with Admiral Sinha. The reason I'm smiling is that when the Manila meeting happened in 2017, I was very excited about the whole Quad, political military dimension of the Quad.
Yeah.
So I spent the next 4 months writing a 60-page paper. It's an war vocational paper. Speaking to serving. I was granted access to serving officers from all 4 countries. laying down this whole strategy, which every year I pull out and kind of laugh at it and I set it aside. No, but jokes aside, so I share his part that it has not really lived up to its political military sort of hopes about a political military role. But I would say that there are fundamental reasons why the Quad would have its own limitations, and it goes back to fundamentally the fact that Japan's constitution really limits what Japan can do in terms of coming to India's aid in a kinetic conflict. I believe right now it can do nothing. I mean, it's because I mean the pacifist dimension. Even though Mr. Abe during his tenure tried to sort of tweak with it a little bit and reinterpret certain things, there are strong limitations. So again, going back to the India-Japan Lemois type of agreement that just happened, if you look at the text makes it very clear that this is all peacetime. Once they're very, very clear, this is peacetime, this is military exercises in peacetime. There's not a single word about what happens when there's a shooting war, right? Because I mean, that's to be expected, right? So maybe Japan evolves over time in terms of how it sees the world. And that in turn would depend on what China does and what happens in the East China Sea, for example. Then maybe something changes. Something very similar is happening with India and Australia. I mean, look, despite the bonhomie, and I would argue that one of the great things that has happened under Mr. Modi is this massive, massive improvement in the India-Australia ties. And it's very welcome. But there are also fundamental limitations on what the relationship can do. Because again, the threat perception, I started this thing in my opening remarks. I talked about political convergence and I'll share a world view and what you need to do. I mean, there is a vague convergence around, Chinese bad behavior and one needs to do certain things. But when you get to the brass tacks and try to derive some common political military objectives from it, it becomes very hard. This became very clear to me when, how Australia was included in the Malabar, right? Because there were media reports that came in earlier last summer, and they were the Indian government was selectively leaking this thing and kind of trial balloons and trying to see how and people were saying things like, oh, if the Chinese do not, improve their behavior in Ladakh, we'll go ahead with including Australia in the Malabar exercise. I was speaking to some Australians when this was coming out, and they were very unhappy because they said, listen, we don't want to be treated so instrumentally and as a political football. So when you look at Ladakh, for example, and the standoff, and you look at the statements that have come out of Australia, they have been very, very measured, very cautious. The same thing that happened during Dokla, which is it's just between India and China, we're going to let them sort of, but very different from how the Trump administration and Republican members of the Congress has dealt with the crisis.
Thank you. Now I'd like to sort of maybe, go up like 20,000 feet or 40,000 feet and ask both of you. So Abhijnan mentioned some of this and so did Admiral Sinha, but in your opening remarks, Abhijnan, you talked about, sort of the factors, political factors and other factors. Defense, as both of you know, it doesn't stand on its own, right? They are not just domestic factors, but sort of, it also has to do with the country's broader strategic policy, grand strategy. And sort of, I have long felt, and I actually argued in my recent book, that India doesn't really have a sort of, a set grand strategy, and that we use sort of, defense, we end up sort of, focusing only on salaries and pensions and then keep some aside for, for purchase of equipment. But if we come back to the India-US relationship, a part of the India-US relationship has been that the United States has always hoped that India will play a role. India will project power in its neighborhood. India will project power in Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, whatever we call it. And India will be a partner, an ally. What I would like each of you to sort of tell me is, is India may be ready to play that role? Do we have the capability to project power in our neighborhood? Today, sort of, is India better off today projecting its power than it was, let's say, a decade ago? Or do we still face the same challenges we did a decade or 2 decades ago? If sort of the reason I'm asking is, as a new American administration takes over in about 15 days, and they plan their policy for the Asia Pacific and Indo-Pacific, do they look at India as a country which is ready to project power, or do they look at India as a country which maybe will take another decade more to think about whether or not it will project power? Admiral Sinha.
Well, I see the cover page of your book, and it's rightly so. It is split after between India and Great. Let me also acknowledge that you may be right, but only partially. Why I'm saying this is that yes, we don't have a written grand strategy, but the political and the security heads are very clear about the directives that they have, and they are working towards that. It doesn't show in the open because they're too worried about what will happen to so and so country, what will happen to this country if we project this. But the actions speak more than the written sort of script. What has happened in Doklam, or what has happened in Ladakh, and the statements which have come out without naming somebody. I mean, this is the first time that India has named China in South China Sea. We had never commented on this so far. And it has been going on from 2014-15 onwards. So I think that we'll have to factor that our economy is still just about 3 trillion, and therefore it will positively take some time, because economy and security, the military, they go hand in hand. Unless you have enough money, it's very difficult for you to build a very strong force. But right now, all I can say is that as far as the demonstration of power of a state is concerned, particularly during the regime of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India has certainly lifted up its image in the international sort of scene, in the global scene. But if this has to be sustained, or if it has to go forward, I agree with you that there is a lot to be done. We are not quite there, mainly because our economy does not permit us to earmark so much of money only for defense, because you have Human Development Index, you had so many other things. So I would broadly say that you are partially right. It is not as bad as one thinks in the US. And there should be no doubt in the United States that India will continue to play a very significant role if, in the part of the Indo-Pacific, which is the Indian Ocean. And I say this with great conviction and confidence, but the tempo has to increase in next 6-7 years. Otherwise, what will happen is the Chinese will get better of you. And if there is any slowdown on the American punishment to the Chinese, then China will become a tiger, and then he will positively become very, very, you'll be very difficult to get him out. So we have a window of about 6-7 years, to my mind. So that is what I think.
Thank you, Admiral. Abhijnan?
Aparna, whenever I think of strategy, I think of it as a process that aligns power and purpose. So there are two aspects to it. Power is material capability, and your ability, classical definition, your ability to make people do things, right? But and then, of course, as Admiral Sinha said, and it's kind of well known. You have dealt with it quite a bit in your book, also in your recent book, that there are capability issues. But I think so that part, I would say it's no. What I would like to interrogate more is the notion of India's purpose, right? So yes, you want to be a great power, but you want to be a great power for what? Right? That way. See, becoming a great power is not an end by itself. There is. I mean, history bears example. Britain became a great power. Why? Because global trade, that's that, maritime trade. They had a big navy, so on and so forth. So this is very well known. What kind of great power should India become? Can India? What is the purpose of India's power? When you look at past examples of Indian behavior in global fora, there is a degree of fence sitting that has happened, right? So, for example, India is very reluctantly speaks out against anybody, right? Just to give you an example, right? Even after June 15th and Galwan, Have you seen the Indian government speak out once about what's going on in Xinjiang? For example, there was a big UN debate, the last General Assembly thing. India neither condemned China nor sided with China. So there is this degree of fence sitting. The problem is that maybe internally the Prime Minister knows what he needs to do, but the signal it sends out, this uncertainty of purpose to friends and partners like the United States, is often very mixed. So you have people, and I'm sure you've heard this in DC quite a bit, that yes, India is very promising. India has a lot of promise. But it seems it's this word, it's this phrase we use about Brazil. It's always a country of the future. It's never a country of today. So there is this uncertainty about India's purpose. There are these capabilities constraints on the material basis of power. And I think these things have to be aligned, right? Because this is an alignment problem, and capabilities certainly have to be bolstered.
Thank you. So my final question to each of you. Since I live in a country where policy is normally framed in four-year time frames, and we're going to start new 4-year period, what would each of you like the India-US defense relationship to, ideally do in the next 4 years? And maybe what you see as some of the challenges in the next 4 years for the India-US defense relationship. Admiral Sinha?
Well, the first challenge that I see is the pace at which the developments have taken place in the last 4 years. Will the Biden administration go by that, or will it slow down because it wants to slow down or push back on China a little bit? So that will actually dictate the pace of movement. It may be good, it may be bad, but we don't know how it is going to turn out. Only time will tell. Very difficult to make a guess. So that is one big challenge. The second big challenge I see is that how much of this Make in India process will be helped by the US. Certainly, you cannot do the technology transfer in a hurry, because that takes time, because country has to absorb the smaller equipment which were put into those bigger platforms. But certainly the factory can be, or the manufacturing plant can be shoved here, which can actually accelerate the pace of the prosperity. And after COVID, it has become even more important. That is number two. What we would like to see is, once again, it goes back to the challenge that we should continue with the same pace. India has, on its own part, India has to be a little more confident of the US support, and don't sort of fall to, because the general discussion in the media here will find that American policy changes every 4 years because the president changes. But if there is a continuity, then it is much better. So that impression we will have to remove only by, this is the right time, because a Republican president has gone and we're getting a Democrat president, and therefore we will see how much sticking to the principles that have been reached that we can do. So I think that broadly it is that I would put it that way. The bilateral relations are not only military relations, the other relations of economic cooperation, logistics, supply chain, vaccine, human assistance and disaster relief, doing things together in a third country. Yeah. So that is another one which happens, because all these basic fundamental agreements having been signed, it is given it's a force multiplier for India, simple as that. And so it is for America. Wherever they thought that there can be some hurdle, we have signed that agreement, and that part is taken care of. But this is not it. This is not it. For becoming a good, sort of very good partner who wake up at night and tell him, come on, just do this, that will take time. And I think that this will define as to how far are we going to go in the progress of our Quad, or Malabar exercise, or maybe transfer of technology. People to people is fantastic. We have more friends in America than we have in India. So I think I'll put it that way.
Abhijnan, you get the last words.
Yeah, I think, whenever I think of where the India-US military relations stand today, I'm always at a loss for thinking what next. Because, you know, as long as you had Becca, the last of the foundational agreements there, everybody was like, oh, you know, next meeting, Becca, that happens, right? Now you have I would call them enabling agreements as opposed to foundational, because it kind of makes it sound like they're more than what they are. But beyond now that the foundational agreements are in place, now that we have basic mechanisms for defense technology cooperation in place, what do you do with these mechanisms? See, unlike Admiral Sinha, I'm a little pessimistic about technology transfer. Because, for example, if you look at DTTI, DTTI has been around for a long time now, right? And it was, Panetta had set it up as a special, as part of the India cell. It was there. One of the big fruits that people hoped, Indians hoped that would come out of DTTI was jet engine technology transfer. Now jet engine technology, there is no way the United States would transfer jet engine technology. So I mean, I think, again, this is the thing, you know, the expectations are large sometimes on our side. So, which brings me to what I expect. Maybe expectations are recalibrated, because this relationship, it's not T20, you know, it's test cricket. So you have to build, you have to keep the momentum. It's a different style of play. So that I worry about the priorities of the Biden administration beyond, you know, what they would do with China. We'll see. I worry if the values pillar of the relationship is something that there would be a special accent on from the Biden administration. More concretely, ostensible human rights concerns about what happens in India, right? To what extent would India be still considered a like-minded partner of the United States under a democratic administration beyond, you know, a common, maybe nebulous shared threat? So these are the concerns I would kind of see, or these are the questions I would see how they play out over the next 4 years.
Sure, Admiral Sinha.
Yeah, I think exactly what Abhijnan said is fine. But let me come back to this DTTI. You know, the DTTI, the drafting of the whole script was done by a team of both countries, the DRDO Armed Forces from here, and a big team from US. You know, under the Deputy Secretary, or I think Under Secretary. No, I think it was the Deputy Secretary of Defense and State. And all these were done with complete agreement of both the countries. The list was much bigger. Much bigger. I mean, I recall that list was very, very long. And my first reaction to DRDO was that, what do you think? They have opened a shop and you can buy this technology. Who will part with this technology? This was my reaction to DRDO in the first meeting. You know, but finally they settled down. These are two important ones. One is that, you know, the jet engine technology, and second one was by the EMOLs for the aircraft carrier. So these were very important ones. And the American delegation thought that this is in the realm of possibilities. And that is why. And you will find more of this being discussed in the media. To be honest, it is not discussed in the, you know, the powers that be in the South Bloc so often, because they know that it is not very easy to do it. All that was required was to possibly, you know, put some of your good engineers from, you know, the GE to the DRDO's lab, and, you know, refine that Kaveri engine. But that didn't happen. Also for the aircraft carrier would have become a success story, but for the stages at which the American aircraft carrier itself was, particularly the EMOL's launch, you know, that is number one. The second part in that was that we wanted to have a successive sort of sortie rate, you know, generated by number of takeoffs it can do very quickly. And that actually implied that a small nuclear plant may be required to generate that continuous energy. Otherwise, the electromagnetic system, to my mind, unlikely to work, unlikely to give you that sortie rate, which obviously was not in the realm of possibilities. And that is one issue where, you know, we still large, you know, disagreements between these two sides as far as the nuclear aspect, the miniaturization of nuclear aspect is concerned. And therefore, that's one area where I think it's a big challenge. So these two issues, if there is some progress here, then I would think that you will find an very close partner who has quite similar equipment, if not same, and then your operability and. But of course, all of these have added to the, as I said, it's a force multiplier. All these agreements for both, for America and for India.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank both of you for what I think is one of the best discussions, even if it's one which I am moderating, that I have actually sat through on India-US defense relations, because you've touched issues which are normally not discussed in both panels. So I'd like to thank you for taking out time. Thank you both for your frankness and for for being willing to explain to the audience the details of some issues which are normally not found in the open sources or in the media. So thank you once again, Admiral Sinha. Thank you, Abhijnan. And it was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.